In the spring of 2010, a lot of organizations across the country were focused on comprehensive immigration reform. And in fact, Reform Immigration for America was leading that drive. And all of a sudden, overnight, Governor Jan Brewer had on her desk a piece of legislation called SB 1070 that would basically create racial profiling, would make criminals out of people who were undocumented and were working in Arizona. It would allow a police officer to just arrest you and call ICE. And so it really paralyzed our communities. It grew fear, but I think out of that fear and anger and frustration really grew the movement to stop SB 1070.
So on Monday, on June 25th, the Supreme Court struck down 3 out of the 4 provisions in SB 1070, and basically those 3 are, it is unconstitutional for Arizona to criminalize workers. It is also unconstitutional for Arizona to say that people would be criminalized if they didn't have proof of their citizenship. And third, that law enforcement cannot arrest anybody without a warrant. So a warrantless arrest was also found to be unconstitutional. So that's a great victory, and it sends a very strong message to all other states that either have similar provisions in their anti-immigrant laws or that are considering this. However, the Supreme Court has reinstated Section 2B, which is the provision that allows, or not allows, but requires law enforcement to verify status of anybody they reasonably suspect to be undocumented, which basically means brown people, right? So it's people of color who will be affected by this, not just undocumented immigrants, but any person of color who the police officers decide to racially profile. And the Supreme Court decision ultimately is that. It's state-sanctioned racial profiling. And this is extremely concerning, not just in Arizona, but in 2013, it's very likely that we'll see other states try to enact very similar legislation based on the Supreme Court's decision. Despite what Governor Brewer is saying, despite what Joe Arpaio is saying, it cannot be implemented yet. The decision did come down on June 25th, but the Supreme Court issued an order to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals saying that the injunction cannot be lifted at least for 25 days. It's possibly going to be longer than that, because from the Ninth Circuit, then it has to go to the district court. So at least for the next 25 days, please know that law enforcement cannot enforce Section 2B of SB 1070.
If you are arrested by immigration, because the police department can still stop you if you have a broken light or your tags are expired, and more than likely that police officer will give you anybody a ticket, but that police officer cannot call ICE. But if you are to be arrested by immigration, you have your rights. We recommend that you give no information other than your name, and you have the right to call an attorney. We recommend that you do is that you can give them your name, just your name. Don't give them a false name, just give them your name. You don't have to show them any papers, but be prepared to call an attorney. So if you don't have an attorney right now and you're undocumented, find someone you trust. Ask your family, ask your neighbors, your friends for that kind of information. But if you are arrested, remain silent and call your attorney. And if you do suffer some kind of abuse, or if you suffer what you think is racial profiling, like Maria said, because usually if they'll think that you're undocumented just because of the color of your skin, or because you speak Spanish, or because of the way you look, that's racial profiling, and we want to learn about that situation. So please call a hotline that has been set up, to hear about your arrest, or to hear about your abuse case, or even if you have a question about SB 1070, call this hotline that's called Respecto. It's 1-855-RESPECTO, 1-855-737-7386, and we wish you luck.
So in response to the Supreme Court's decision, the Department of Homeland Security issued a directive saying a couple of things. One is they have rescinded, or they've basically terminated the 287G model with respect to the street enforcement. So law enforcement no longer will have the ability to work closely with immigration under their 287G agreements. There were 7 of these agreements in Arizona that have now been canceled. However, the jail model of 287G continues to be in effect. And we are asking the Department of Homeland Security to consider that, to reconsider that, and they should be terminating those as well, along with ESCOM. But those are still functioning. So if you've been arrested and are taken to jail in Arizona, you still are at risk to then be transferred over to immigration, and it's really important that you as Petra said, that you exercise your right to remain silent and that you ask for an attorney and not speak or say anything until you've spoken to an attorney. The Department of Homeland Security has also said that in response to the Supreme Court's decision, they, by law, have to respond. They have to receive the calls from law enforcement if they stop somebody, but they will not be providing any information from any roadside calls from law enforcement unless the person is considered has been convicted of a serious violation, a violent crime. Otherwise, they will not be responding and providing any information about kind of average undocumented workers.
I think SB 1070 was a wake-up call, and I think many of us in the Latino and immigrant community are taking responsibility to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. And the way we are doing that is, number one, is educating the community on their rights. But we also want people to get involved as much as possible. So that means, going to your school, your church, an organization, and getting involved in some way. If you go to a Know Your Rights meeting and have some information, pass that on. But also connect to the organizations that are on the ground. There's lots of organizations across the state, in Yuma, in Tucson, in Phoenix, that we are all working towards the same goal of making sure that our immigrant and Latino families are not abused because of SB 1070. And the biggest abuse could be of racial profiling. And secondly is that families may be separated unduly, because we do know that's one of the things that is happening with deportations. Families are being separated by choice because they fear to live in Arizona, so they leave behind their children to continue in their education. But the way to get involved, the way to push back is by registering to vote if you're eligible, because all of us are in this situation together. Any person of color can be suspect to being undocumented, and I think that's just unjust and undignified that people need to live that way. So go to thepromisearizona.org. There's onearizona.org that are doing lots of civic engagement work, and please join the movement.
It's really important to note that these legislations are being brought up by politicians, and they have special interests, and so we got to make sure that we use these legislations and what they do as litmus tests, and know who are with us and who are against us. And the fact is that, like Petra said, SB 1070 was one of the states, and it actually passed, and other states have similar legislations. We know that Alabama, took upon itself to be the #1 worst legislation in the country. I'm from Florida, and I know that in Florida they try to pass this, but it was the people on the ground fighting to ensure that SB 1070 and other legislations would not spread across the country. And so we got to hold these politicians accountable, because we know these legislations hurt our community, they hurt our people. And you wouldn't want a nurse to perform open heart surgery, right? A nurse is not a doctor, the same way a police officer is not an immigration agent. And so we got to make sure that we keep our community educated around this issue, that people know their rights, and that people also hold these politicians accountable to what they're doing, these legislations that are harming and are hurting our communities.